Thank you so much, Larry. Welcome, everyone. It's great to see such a good turnout. Thank you, Michael, for being here.
Absolutely.
This is really the continuation, I think, of a conversation that Michael and I have had in public and private for many years, for more than a decade, really, since I first arrived in Los Angeles in 2004. And Michael, along with being a very talented and prolific architect with projects at a range of scales around the country now, is also, I think, one of the most thoughtful observers of Los Angeles as a city, as an urban object, as an urban condition. He's done quite a bit of writing on that subject, and his architectural projects, in ways that we will discuss this afternoon, respond to the city in very active ways and really offer a kind of reading of the city in ways that we'll get into. But since this is a conversation on future cities, I thought we'd start with a conversation about the suburbs of the past, namely Levittown, where you grew up on Long Island, really the first planned suburban subdivision. I'm curious what that childhood was like, what kind of a house you grew up in, how that affected your thinking about architecture in cities, and what ways it prepared or didn't prepare you for a career as an architect working in a place like LA.
It's always one of those the fact that I grew up in Levittown, that people are, I think, completely mystified by, because its reputation is as a place that, at best, is not so much an architectural setting or a place where architecture began, and at worst, a place that embodies a lot of the almost cliches about the worst of suburban life. But growing up, I found it to be an incredible place, and to a large extent because it was such, at the time, a vibrant community. There were lots of kids, parents all got together, drank constantly, it seemed like, and the spaces of those neighborhoods, for the most part, blurred together. There were fences, but there were always gates in those fences and ways of getting over them and under them. And it seemed like one large, very connected landscape. For me, I grew up in a house that was one of the traditional, typical Levittown models. And at one glance, you could say it was a very traditional house. It had a gable, it had shutters on it, but it had all of these indications of the future of what the single-family house was becoming, and references to modernism, actually, and to a lot of California modernism. Double-sided fireplace, big plate glass window that looked out onto a kidney-shaped patio. The kitchen was the first space that you came into. It was the social heart of the house. And I have incredible memories of that as something that felt like it had been thought about. And that, I think, was, when I think about Levittown, or a lot of those planned communities, for as many of their problems, as many of the issues that they have spun off, there was a lot of planning often around them, and that's something very intriguing to think about as we talk about the future and planning being part of that.
And did you aspire to be an architect when you were a kid?
Not at that age. I was 12 years old. This is really getting way. I had a friend who was an industrial designer, or his dad was an industrial designer, and he had a drafting table. They had a house that looked like the Brady Bunch, and he had a drafting table, and we used to play architect, at least what we thought architecture was. And we would draw a room, and we would get the Sears catalog, which is totally dating me, and we would cut out furniture, and we would place it in the rooms. It was a kind of almost interior design, but it was the first sense that I had that the idea of the environment was something that you could have an effect on. And that grew this idea that architecture wasn't only something I could do, it was something that it was a way of seeing the world. It gave you a form to express how you saw the world, and that was really extraordinary.
And after school at Rhode Island School of Design and then the GSD at Harvard, you came out here in the late 80s, 88,
Yeah,
is that right, to work
that's
in
right,
Frank Gehry's
exactly.
office. What was that Los Angeles that you arrived to discover at that point when you first started working in Frank's office?
Well, I'd come out in the first because a professor of mine who was from, or is from Los Angeles, Robert Mangorian, taught for many years at SCI-Arc, had taught a studio at the GSD at Harvard, and we all came out here for about a week of just absolutely nonstop, 24-hour exploration of the city. Robert would tell us to go there, and we'd go there, and we saw, I think, as much as you could pack into seeing in a week. We saw. I was the person in the group who was completely fascinated by the city, and probably felt the most comfortable here. Most of my friends who were on the trip were happy to get back to Cambridge. But I thought this place felt incredibly familiar in a way. And at first I thought it was because as a kid I watched a lot of TV, and so all of the sets, all of the backdrops from those shows seemed to be Los Angeles. But I came to realize that instead what it was, I believe, was that Los Angeles in many ways is a post-war suburb in the same way that Levittown was. And a lot of the characteristics and the machinations and the qualities of the place felt very familiar. I understood it, and I understood how to move around it and what it felt like and how that low density and those big distances between seeing things felt normal. I knew how to exist in those spaces, how to occupy myself driving from there to there, without it seeming like it was an aimless trip. And I think that's part of it, is that the city was, at least felt like a lower density city than it is becoming. It was a city that was easier to get around, where mobility felt like it was still connected to the old vision of what Los Angeles is, that you could be in Pasadena in the morning and you could be in Santa Monica in the afternoon and you could be someplace else later on. And at that age, coming to the city, it allowed us to explore the city in incredible ways, because you could just go, and it felt very easy to connect to. And a lot of the neighborhoods that existed also felt intact, and that was interesting.
I should point out that we're looking at images, cycling through some images of your work, I think, as they're coming up. That's not one, but if you see projects of his, we'll refer to them, I think, as they flash by. But that city that you're describing is really the Rayner-Banham Los Angeles,
That's
a city where there's a kind of easy mobility and there's a sense of connection across the region made possible by the freeway. Of course, not long after you arrived, by the early 90s, there's a transition to a different Los Angeles. Mike Davis's City of Courts, to use the title of that, borrow the title of that really dark sort of dystopian book about what LA became as that post-war dream of mobility and a kind of democratic idea of housing in ways that I think we'll get into began to break down. So at what point did the city change? Was it relatively soon after you got here that you got a sense that some of the Banham dream wasn't working out, or was beginning to break apart?
It was in the early 90s, because there was a series of events which I'm sure many people remember. The riots in the early 90s, mountains seemed like they were exploding in fire constantly. There was a flood, El Nino, and the pressures, the social pressures, definitely, the political changes that were going on, the sense that the city was having to come to grips with significant changes, significant new pressures, was something many of us were talking about amongst ourselves, because it seemed as if the city was caught in this tension, this battle almost, sometimes visibly, sometimes more implicitly, or sometimes more under the carpet, of trying to stay the same, but clearly having to, if not evolve, at least confront some of these very real challenges that were making themselves felt in very intense ways. And that, on the one hand, that was incredibly disturbing, because coming to the city as somebody who chose to come to the city because of a fascination and, to a certain extent, an emerging love affair with the city, that to see that the city fighting with itself so intensely was a little bit like watching your parents have a fight at dinner, because you weren't sure what side was right and what side was wrong, and the issue seemed very complicated, and you're probably too young to completely grasp all of the backstory yet.
And the leading architects of that period, the best known projects by architects we now think of as part of the LA school, not just Frank Gehry, but Morphosis, Eric Owen Moss, Frank Israel, and others, really responded to those fissures in society by producing an architecture that really mirrored it, that really wanted to reflect the fragmentation of the city, even the way that the city perhaps was pulling itself apart, and even representing that kind of civil war that you've been talking about. And your work has been very different. It has been interested in many ways, which I'd like to get into, in, I wouldn't say healing those fissures or pretending they're not there, but pointing the way, particularly in the more recent work, pointing the way toward a different Los Angeles, kind of perhaps a post-suburban one. And you've talked about that as a kind of anticipatory urbanism and an architecture that reflects that. Can you talk a little bit about that and maybe how it's played out in some of the recent projects that folks might be familiar with, like the One Santa Fe project in the Arts District or others?
Well, many of those people that you mentioned, Frank certainly, Tom and Michael, Morphosis, Eric Moss, I think that work was so important because it gave architecture a way of, or it made you understand that architecture could begin to represent many of those tensions, many of those pressures. And that was an extraordinary tool to realize that architecture had in its capability. At the same time, I began to believe that if architecture was going to have an even deeper relationship and maybe even more catalytic component to it, to help try to move the city towards the future, that it was going to have to take on complexities that went beyond form, went beyond representation, and started to develop other ways for it to be active in the conversation about the city. The first project that really started that thinking for me was Inner City Arts in the Skid Row area of downtown Los Angeles, which has developed over many phases, and I've continued to be involved with this school, which is a private nonprofit that partners with LAUSD to teach art for public school kids who don't have that in their classrooms. But it's really expanded to take on many other types of responsibilities and to be now, in many ways, a full community center for that area. Inner City Arts was this balance of trying to make a building a kind of oasis for the kids who were going to school there, for the teachers and for the faculty of LAUSD, and to do that through the form and the gardens and the landscape, to make a deeply aesthetic place, maybe even a place of beauty in the middle of that part of the city. But I began to explore other ways in which the architecture could try to take on more, so it wouldn't become a fortress, that it was more open to the city, that it would reuse existing parts of buildings from the city, for it to be more forcefully connected with its programming to parts of the city. For instance, there's a black box theater that gets used for a lot of community programming. And that building became such a rallying point around that community that it gave me a lot of confidence that architecture, even in a small institutional way, could begin to have a strong effect in the city as a whole. That led to a number of projects, many of the housing projects that we've been working on, actually with Skid Row Housing Trust and Mike Alvidrez, who I don't know if he's still here, but I know was here a little while ago, that are projects trying to provide permanent supportive housing for the residents who live in those buildings. They are about trying to create community within the buildings, to develop almost a microcosm of the city within the buildings, to see how, as experiments, they can point to a way in which relationships can get built in the city. But they're also very much, as a whole, an urban project. They are trying to say very positive, optimistic, and hopefully progressive things about how buildings in the city can connect to the life around them, as opposed to being more isolated and separated from the city.
Now, in a traditional reading of a city, that it would be the job of public agencies to build that kind of urbanism, to lay out a plan for the kinds of public spaces, the kinds of spaces to build relationships that you're talking about. Were you in part responding to, I mean, Los Angeles in the post-war decades was so deeply privatized and has been so politically fragmented. Were you in part responding to a vacuum in sort of public energy in building those kinds of spaces?
It's probably terrible to say, but I loved that vacuum at the time because it meant that you had a lot of room for experimentation. And if you were interested in this idea of what the next thing could be, what the future of the city might look like and how it might operate, then having some amount of creative freedom to try to make that and to also make mistakes in those experiments without a lot of pressures or necessarily a lot of eyes on those projects was really an extraordinary opportunity, really a benefit. It wasn't that there weren't city agencies or public agencies looking at the city. For instance, the CRA was around at the time, but the interests were more in large-scale, more traditionally transformative projects. And what I was interested in, partially because those were the projects I was getting, were the smaller, more iterative projects that I began to believe you could still point to what Los Angeles writ large might actually be like through these smaller projects. You didn't have to do Staples Center. You could do something else and have just as positive an effect.
And do you think that creative freedom is still here for younger architects? A complaint I hear from them all the time is this has become such an expensive, regulated, in some ways risk-averse city that it's hard for them to get a footing in the same way that you did when you were starting out, and in particular in contrast to the way that Frank, Gary, Tom Main's generation did when there was both room to operate physically and there was land to build on, and there were clients who could commission young architects to do a small-scale project. Do you think that opportunity is still out there?
I think it's harder, but I don't think it's only harder for younger architects. I think it's harder in general. I believe we confront similar types of issues around constraints on creative bandwidth, freedom, however you want to describe it. I think it's harder in some ways to be a younger architect, obviously, because you're trying to establish yourself as a practice. And that's one of the things Los Angeles has always been so terrific in doing, is to be a platform for a lot of experimentation, a lot of newer ideas, especially from a younger generation of architects. I don't think it's regulation so much. I don't know that it's expense so much, although those things are big parts of it. I think it's, and it's one of the things that worries me the most about and for Los Angeles, is I think that there's a psychological change that's starting to take hold, which is more anxiety and fear-driven around development and projects that are going to significantly change the city. And there are lots of understandable reasons why that anxiety is developing around density and gentrification and transportation and resource management. All of those things are very real, but the effect is, I believe, to have us as a culture starting to step back from a big part of our identity, which has been that Southern California, Los Angeles in particular, has been a place where creativity has always been one of our currencies and one of our strongest export economies. And that I think is something that should concern us all.
It's fascinating to see how that plays out in architecture versus the other creative fields, because I think Los Angeles has very much embraced its role in the last few years as being a place where, on the cutting edge, the leading edge of production of the arts. But it's a different story when you're talking about writing screenplays or writing novels or making art versus trying to make architecture, because of course it's as you said, a much more constrained art form. But that anxiety about development is something I really wanted to get into. This is an opportune time, in some ways a fraught time, to be having a conversation about the state of the city. Both of us, I think, have written about the ways in which Los Angeles is now a place that has finally, Mike Davis in City of Quartz talks about LA as a city that dreamt of being infinite, that ate the desert and all of that. This is a city, I think both of us would agree, that has finally realized that it can't dream of being infinite any longer. It realizes its limits, recognizes its limits in many ways. And that means development is sort of folding back on itself. But there is a sense, as we look at a ballot that will have another transit tax on it, which could have a fundamental long-term impact in terms of transit investment, but also a ballot initiative in Santa Monica, the Love Initiative, very much produced by that anxiety about development, and the Neighborhood Integrity Initiative set for the March ballot. And there are two very different realities, I think, that are clashing in these conversations. On the one hand, if you look at the data that has been produced in the last couple of years, it's very clear that just in terms of housing, we underproduced housing in LA County by something like 1 million units, beginning with the very slow growth movements of the late 70s and 1980s. And I think we're paying the price for that in terms of housing, the housing crisis, affordability, and all of that. On the other hand, there is a sense, and it's now coming to the ballot in the Love Initiative and the NII, that the city is being overwhelmed by development. How do you reconcile those two views, or is it even possible to reconcile those two very different views of what's happening here?
Well, I do think it is very difficult because the issues are complex. Like a lot of these issues that are confronting us, and the ballot initiatives that often try to distill those complexities into an easily digestible or votable issue. What's confronting the city is a very complex one. But I also think that means that we have to find different ways of having a debate or a conversation, a public conversation, public debate about these things, and not necessarily depend on those types of ballot initiatives to somehow solve our problems. Because the danger, and I think it's a very real danger, is that something gets passed and then we get what we asked for, and that becomes something that's even more problematic for the city in the long run. the way that many of those initiatives, as I understand them, the neighborhood integrity initiative, for instance, are being written is to put the brakes on and to try to create a pause, and then to, in some cases, rewrite the regulations, or in fact, just either create a pause or to put it to public ballot. The danger in that, I believe, is that the control probably will continue to rest with the people who can control that conversation. And those are often the same people that those ballot initiatives are, same groups that they're concerned with. The other part of it is that, to go back a little bit to the question of what's happened to Los Angeles over this time, you're right, we've had this conversation about the city having arguably finally reached its boundaries. And for many years, the city had this kind of manifest destiny idea that we could just keep pushing the boundaries out further and further. And a lot of our optimism was tied to that. Not only our building and our way of making and housing people and providing jobs, but literally I think our identity and psychology was tied to this idea of pushing the boundaries out. When you can't do that anymore and you are being forced to look back to the city for things like density, the real question for me is how you keep open that similar type of personality, that similar type of optimism and potential in the buildings that we're building in a more dense way. And the way to do that, I don't believe, is to say no more building or we're going to vote on every building, but is to try to find ways to open the floodgates to creativity in an even more significant way, to invent forms of density that are our own as opposed to being imported from someplace else. So for instance, housing and density of housing, it's true, we shouldn't be putting a 30-story tower in the middle of a one-story neighborhood. But there are ways of beginning to write density into the city in extremely beneficial and creative ways that will pay dividends over the long term. We have to find a way to have that public conversation.
And I have been trying to write a lot recently about reminding folks that we do have a pre-war history of really innovative multifamily housing architects like Irving Gill, Richard Neutra, and Schindler in their early projects doing modernist multifamily work that was as innovative and forward-looking as anything that was being produced anywhere in the world. And then in the post-war decades, of course, we invested very heavily in this idea of the single-family neighborhood and a kind of suburban notion of the city. But we do have, I think, in the DNA of the city, a different model that we can look back to and draw from in terms of that idea about optimism and a kind of forward-looking attitude, and I hope we can remember that. The last thing I want to ask you about before we open it up to some questions from the audience is a recent turn in your work that I find really fascinating toward a scale of infrastructure. And one of the paradoxes, of course, of the post-war shift in Los Angeles, we talked about how deeply privatized the city was. But at the same time, there was incredibly ambitious infrastructure being built in terms of the freeways, and think about the channelized LA River. Whatever we think of those now, they were incredibly ambitious symbols of a kind of regional ambition. But one of the paradoxes is that even though they were public infrastructure, both the freeway and the channelized river had the byproduct of really creating privatized space. The freeway, of course, is deeply privatized, and the river was really closed off from any kind of public access when it was turned into just a flood control channel. But as part of a series of pieces I did on sort of rethinking the freeway, we published a proposal of yours for a section of the 134. And of course, you're working on the 6th Street Bridge now under construction. So I want to ask about moving to that scale and the ways in which you see infrastructure having a kind of local role to play in this new Los Angeles in a way that wasn't true of the freeway or in the river in those new projects that you're working on.
Well, the freeway, for instance, the freeway infrastructure as a whole it's been on my mind because it's so characteristic of Los Angeles. And if you take the freeways as an example, and you go back to the early 90s during the riots, one of the things that why for me, the highways were so emblematic was that if you look at Rayner Banham, he talked about the highways in the most
rhapsodic
it
ways.
was
Yeah.
unbelievably romantic about being on the highway and the experience and the connectivity. And that
I think he called it the most relaxed hour that every Angelino spends every day is behind the
That's
wheel
right,
of the
that's
car
right, that's right.
on the freeway, not something
That's
we
right.
would say
Flash forward and you realize our problem. In the early 90s, at the same time when I came to the city, there was that idea of the highways for infrastructure for me. And then in the early 90s,
And this is the 6th Street Bridge, we should say,
exactly.
6th Street.
During the riots, one of the most significant moments was when the quote-unquote riots moved north and jumped the 10 freeway. And the city as a whole seemed to just panic. And you realized how much the highways had been separating, had been these lines physically often, but also, again, psychologically, of division within the city, that they had kept the city largely apart. They were much more a part of that Mike Davis dystopian view at that point.
Sorry to interrupt, but just think about how much time we spent talking about an east-west divide in Los Angeles, where I think you're right, the really significant divide has been the north-south divide,
exactly.
and the 10 is probably the most important example
That's
of that.
right. And I began to talk about, again, this is something we've talked about a lot, about how much the highways were by being separators, that they were this kind of monoculture. They only did one thing. You got on them and you drove from one place to another, but something like of that scale, the 10 freeway, where we put so much investment into it and they had such a big effect on neighborhoods, that for them only to have one responsibility was it was untenable, it was unsustainable.
And really repel, if you look at that image, repel the idea of neighborhood scale.
Absolutely.
Thinking only, obviously, at the regional scale, about the regional register, and just sort of rejecting the idea of neighborhood scale altogether.
It was at that moment that I started to try to imagine, could infrastructure take on multiple responsibilities? Could it move from a kind of monoculture to a multiculture? Could it provide other benefits in the city? And in that picture where you're seeing Star Apartments, which is a housing project we did right next to the city, there were small pieces of that where I began to explore actually making a relationship with the highway as our grand main street. But even more literally, in the 6th Street Bridge project, I've worked to try to make that with the larger team in the city a bridge that doesn't just get you from east to west across the river, but also ties the bottom and the top from the river to the flats, all the way up to the bridge for bicycles and pedestrians, to make it a more multimodal knot of connections. In the 134 proposal that we worked on with you, I was trying to imagine the freeway bridge, the 134 by the Rose Bowl going over the Arroyo, as something that took on a series of more environmental as well as political and social issues and problems, and whether that was something infrastructure could be rethought to do. So, for instance, we were cladding it in some newer technological materials to reduce the noise and noise pollution, which has a huge effect up and down the entire portion of the Arroyo. We were looking at using these titanium dioxide cellular structures on the roof that act as catalytic converters when the sun hits it and cleans the carbon monoxide out of the air, to make the entire roof a solar farm, because it's so hard to find large pieces of land in the city to accumulate enough solar panels to make a big difference. I started to imagine, well, you have all this land over the highways. You could use that as a place where these solar cells were placed and generate enormous amount of electricity. And I've started to work on an idea that energy could be fed back into Pasadena Water and Power to produce basically additional revenue that could then be targeted for the schools, the public school systems, which seem to be perennially underfunded. That kind of connection of technological, engineering, architectural, aesthetic, social, political ideas, for me, that's the future of infrastructure.
And that's really the crucial strategy for me of that project is taking the idea of neighborhood relationship to the freeway, and it's really neighborhoods close to freeways that have borne the brunt of noise and air pollution for all these decades, and really thinking about how to feed some of the benefits from, let's say, the production of solar energy and selling that back to the city that could be use that revenue directly in the neighborhood, really turning on its head the idea of how a neighborhood thinks about a freeway that's in its midst to something that can produce positive local benefit instead
It'd
of
be
being
extraordinary if you
kind
actually
of
wanted, you said, I want to live next to the highway.
Next to the
That would
freeway,
be
yeah.
unbelievable.
Yeah, and I think that shift is just one of the reasons we wanted to publish that project is just to suggest to people that you could turn all of that logic upside down and really think about it in a completely radically new way in terms of, ultimately a desire maybe to live as close to the freeway as possible, particularly if the schools in that neighborhood are the best schools in the city.